Okay, so let's talk about conservation. One of the most important factors in conservation is a human population. Our population has been increasing at a very rapid rate for the last few hundred years. The first big boom in human population occurred at the beginning of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And the population increased slowly until the Industrial Revolution. And this little blowout graph here is just an expansion of this so that we can see that the rate of increase changed with the Industrial Revolution and then changed again with the industrialization of agriculture. Right now, the organization that continues to make good population predictions is the United Nations, and this is their most recent prediction. Normally, they have one every few years, so this one is from last year, from 2019. The human population today, so here we are today, 2020, is about 7.6 billion. And it's forecast to reach 8 billion, see this line here for 8 billion, in the year 2024. And so what they do is they forecast the changing population based on if nothing changes, so that's this higher line here, if the rate of expansion of the human population slows considerably, or their best estimate here in the middle based on current best forecast, because the rate of change is slowing. And it looks like the human population is approaching a plateau and will plateau, according to their latest predictions, around 11 billion, but not for about 70 or 80 years. So how do we know that the rate is changing? So one of the ways we can look at the rate is by looking at how fast the human population doubled. So the doubling rate has been increasing, and the doubling rate, this is one of the things that really alarmed ecologists and population biologists in the 1970s, was that they couldn't see the change in direction yet. So if we go back to the year 1000, the Earth's population was about 250 million people. It took 650 years to double to 1 billion around the year 1650. It then took only 154 years to double again from 1 to 2 billion. It took only 127 years to double again to 2 billion. It took 47 years only to double again to 4 billion in 1974. And since then, now the rate is not, the doubling rate is not continuing to decrease. So that's good. So now the forecasted next doubling to 8 billion is forecasted to occur in 2024 at the earliest. So if this rate slows, if the rate of population increase slows more, it could actually be a little bit longer than 50 years. But this is good news. This is good news. This is a sign that the rate of increase is slowing and we're starting to head towards another plateau in the human population, which is a good thing. Even if the human population started to decrease in 100 years from now, I don't think that would be a bad thing at all. There are many experts who think we are already above the carrying capacity of the planet, and we can see by the slowly depleting of the natural resources. So what happened? Why would our population rate suddenly change? So if you look at hunter-gatherer populations, which is the pre-industrial over here, or even early agricultural societies were fairly isolated. Periodic starvation events were frequent. Death from disease and accidents, of course, good medical care was common. So the birth rate was high. The average number of children per woman was around 6 to 8. And that's much higher than industrialized countries today. But the death rate was also very high. Infant mortality was around 50%, and that's up through age 5. So the chances of a child reaching their 5th birthday was only about 50%. The chances of a child reaching reproductive age and actually reproducing was even less than that. So high death rate, high birth rate. Then, as industrialization began, roads were better, communication was better, the rate of famines declined, and only very isolated populations suffered famines. Populations that were now part of large countries connected by roads. If one particular area had a bad year crop-wise, they could get food from somewhere else. So famine declined, medical care improved, and so even though the birth rate didn't really change, the death rate was going down. Deaths from famine especially went down. And so that led to a population explosion. But, and this continued, this high birth rate with an average number of children born per woman around 6, continued well into the 1950s in the United States. So then the birth rate starts to decline. Once you have an urban population, there was a slow transition from most people living in rural farming kind of and ranching communities to now most people live in urban areas, and fewer people, a smaller percentage of the population lives in rural areas. Well, when you're in a rural environment, children are your free workers, and that provides motivation to have more children. They're your free farm labor. But in an urban population, especially in the modern world, children are not your free workers. They can't work in your business, and instead, children cost money. You got to pay to send them to school, etc. So that is one of the things that has driven declining birth rates in the industrial world. And especially declining birth rate is linked to opportunities for women. One of the #1 things that has been shown to decrease the fertility rate in a country from 6 or more per woman down to 2 to 3, which is what it is in most of the industrial world, is education. If you keep girls in school until they're 18, then they're likely to get a job after school, and they're not going to have their first baby until they're in their 20s. And that alone decreases the birth rate. If girls are having their first baby when they're 12, 13, 14 years old, they're going to have more total children than if they have their first baby when they're 22 years old. And in an industrial society, like in the United States, postponing that first baby is very common. The average age of first birth continues to increase in the United States. And finally, you get to a stable population, which is where many industrial countries are today, where they have both a low birth rate and a low death rate. In the United States, for example, our population today would be very stable. It's only immigration that's increasing our population today. But that's certainly not a negative thing at this point. Another way we can look at human populations is with age structure pyramids. What an age structure pyramid is, instead of just looking at the total number of individuals in a population, it looks at how those numbers are spread out by sex, between males and females, and by age. So if you look at the population on the right here, this is the age pyramid for Madagascar in 2010. And this structure with, you notice the ages are here on the y-axis, and so the wider this bar is, the more individuals there are of that age. And you notice there's lots of young people, so the red bars are children who are not yet reproductive age. The orange bars are people are of reproductive age, and the yellow are post-reproductive individuals. And you notice that the vast majority of these populations are young people, and that is how every human population was until recently. All hunter-gatherer societies have this type of age structure. Pre-industrial agricultural societies have this type of age structure. So you can see why there was a high birth rate and a high death rate in balance, because we have very few, there's a kind of a continuous risk of death at every age. So that's why we see this steady attrition as the age increases. Now, if we look at a modern industrial society, so this happens to be for Canada in 2010, but the US would be very similar to this. You'll see something very different. And what you notice is that there's fewer young people, fewer reproductive age people, and there's actually a lot of people of post-reproductive age. So lots of adults, fewer children, a lot more old people. And you even can see something interesting on here. You notice there's a big jump here between this bar, which is the 40 to 45s, and then this bar, which is the 50 to 55s. So add 10 years to that if you want to figure out these people's current ages, because this is from 2010. This is the post-World War II baby boom. That after World War II, there was an increase in births, and that big cohort of young people has been slowly working its way up the age pyramid here as those individuals age. Some countries have an even more mushroom-shaped pyramid, countries like Japan and Italy that have very low birth rates, below 2 per woman. Which is below what they call replacement rate. It's even more lopsided than this. But we have changed. Our species has changed from this type of structure through industrialization in just the last 150 years or so to this type of a structure where we have a lot of adults and fewer children. Why do we even have old age? We just take it so for granted. We don't think about how weird this is for species to have. There are very, very few species that have any kind of a post-reproductive old age. All the other primates die while they're still reproductive. So it's not unusual. This is now that we have, many primates in zoos, we have seen this. That a female will give birth to an infant at age 40 or 45, and then within a year or two dies of old age. So that's normal for mammals. What humans do is abnormal, to have 40 years of life after the reproductive age is over. And for women, it's very clear-cut when that occurs. But even for men, it is very unusual for men to father a child after age 50. It happens, but it's very atypical for men to father a child after age 50. And for women, it also is, even with the help of medical assistance and fertility technology, having a natural-born child after age 50 is extraordinarily rare. Now, some people, you might have heard that, well, this is a modern thing because hunter-gatherers only live to be 30 years old, and that is absolutely not the case. What is true is that the average lifespan was in the 30s for hunter-gatherers. And so what that means is that when you take every single individual and the age that they died and you average them together, you get something in the 30s. So, but remember, infant mortality was very high. So if you have 50% of the individuals who are born die before they reach age 5, that's going to really bring the average down. And that's exactly what happened, is that Most of the increase that we have in lifespan today to now, lifespan in the US is close to 80 for men and women. Most of that change is due to decreasing infant mortality and decreasing death from infections and childhood illnesses. It's not from people who already make it to age 60 living longer. In fact, if you make it to age 60, your chances of living to 80 are about the same now as they were 200 years ago. So our change in lifespan is not due to old people living longer. It's due to young people living longer. So that means that our species has always had menopause. So this is a trait, as we talked about in human evolution. That means that this evolved by natural selection. So what was the selective force that drove the evolution of this unique trait that only humans have in primates? And hardly any other animal species have evolved. It must have been a positive thing in natural selection to have evolved. There must have been a driving selective force that led to just the fact that menopause even happens, and the fact that you can get decades of lifespan after that. So what benefit did this have? And remember, the benefit has to be about increasing reproductive success. So there have been studies of hunter-gatherer populations, and they have found that in family groups where there are postmenopausal women in the group, grandmothers, that infant mortality was lower, children weighed more at different ages, which means that they were getting more to eat, and children were more likely to survive to 18. So that means that having grandmothers in the household during hunter-gatherer times, which was almost all of our entire history of our species. Our species has been around for 250,000 years at least, and only the last 150 years or so have been post-industrial, and only about 10,000 in agricultural societies. Before that, everybody was a hunter-gatherer. All humans were hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years. So that's why studying hunter-gatherers would help us figure out how this trait evolved. So that's the current hypothesis, is that menopause and the decades of increased lifespan that we have post-reproductive for both males and females. I mean, our lifespan is much longer than our closest relatives. Chimpanzees and gorillas in the best environment in a zoo can live to be in their 40s, maybe 50. So we have added decades of lifespan, but not increased reproductivity. Instead, we've added this non-reproductive old age. So that must have increased the survival of children and grandchildren, and that's why it was selected for by natural selection. So what good would a grandmother do in a household in hunter-gatherers? Well, she could watch the children while the parents go out after food. That would be one thing. She would also have skills that could help the survival of her grandchildren by teaching them things. The same you could say for elderly hunter-gatherer men, is that they would have skills and knowledge. They might remember the last drought, remember the last time some disease went through, and know what people did. So what is biodiversity? That has become a buzzword in the last 30 or 40 years. Biodiversity means several different things. Well, bio means living things, so we're only talking about living things when we're talking about biodiversity. It can just mean the number of species in a particular area. So areas that have huge numbers of different species of organisms are considered rich in biodiversity. Ecosystem diversity. There are places where there are transitions between many different ecosystems in a small area. Like, think of a mountain. At the low altitudes, you might have tropical rainforest. Then you go up 20,000 feet in elevation, and now you have a dry, much colder forest environment. And then you go up still more, and now you have a more a cold, treeless environment. So ecosystem diversity will increase the biodiversity of a region as well. Also, the genetic diversity of each species. If you have huge numbers of a particular species, that generally means that there's more genetic diversity as well. Very small populations tend to have low genetic diversity. Huge populations tend to have higher genetic diversity. Which makes species more able to survive environmental changes. Species with very low genetic diversity and low numbers are more likely to just be completely wiped out by a single thing, like a disease or an environmental catastrophe. Species that are large and diverse and have huge numbers and a high genetic diversity are more likely to survive changes or diseases or having to move to a new habitat. The number of subspecies for a particular species is also an indication that's related to genetic diversity. So species have to be, subspecies have to be significantly different from each other to be called subspecies. For example, our species, even with the great variety that we can see in our species, we don't have biological subspecies. But this example here shows tiger subspecies, and there are several tiger subspecies that are extinct, and several that are endangered, and some that are doing pretty well, like Bengal tigers. Sumatran tigers are endangered. Indochina tigers and South China tigers are in trouble, and so are the Siberian tigers. They've been making a bit of a comeback, and several extinct tigers, including, you might be surprised to know that there used to be tigers fairly far north here in Asia. So that's a loss of genetic diversity. Losing subspecies is a loss of genetic diversity of that species as a whole. An environment that's diverse, that's biodiverse, is beneficial to humans. And there are a lot of people, like myself, who think that a diverse ecosystem is beneficial in its own right, and we don't need to count the ways that it benefits humans. But it does help convince people to preserve ecosystems when you can tell them how it will directly benefit them. Humans harvest food, firewood, fiber to make clothing, things to make their homes out of from wild ecosystems. Having a intact forest or an intact marsh can purify the air and water as groundwater and surface water trickles through that ecosystem. It will be cleaner for humans to drink. It also can break down wastewater. There are some cities, small cities, that are using wetlands to process wastewater because it helped the bacteria that are found in wetlands help break down human waste. These biodiverse ecosystems also help stabilize the Earth's climate because of the rampant photosynthesis that is going on in these ecosystems. Carbon dioxide, we're going to talk more about climate change later in this series, but CO2 is the main gas of concern for global warming. Plants absorb CO2 during photosynthesis. So increasing the number of large photosynthesizing organisms like trees is good for the Earth's climate. Can also help moderate floods and droughts. The flood moderation, this we saw very directly when Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, and most of the wetlands that were there have been lost, and that caused the hurricane surge, the tidal surge from the hurricane to be more damaging than it would have been, say, 200 years ago when there was more wetland there protecting the coast. Crop pests can also be controlled by wild predators of those pests. So there are insects that prey on other insects, and those insects may be in intact forests and other ecosystems that will come into crop areas and attack insects that are eating crops. They are also a source of wild pollinators, bees that can pollinate crops. These wild plants can also be a source for crop breeding, and now that we're doing making genetically modified plants, we can take genes from wild species, a gene that has disease resistance or some other trait that we want, and put it into our crop varieties or livestock. There are medicines that have come from wild sources, and we'll talk about a few of those. It's also just enjoyable to have an intact ecosystem for visiting and not removing things from. Having all of this diverse ecosystem also gives us a buffer for changing environment. It gives us places to go to look for new things we might need, like medicines or new crop varieties. If those are eliminated, then we're stuck with the domestic plants that we have right now. Some older medicines that are from plants that were once harvested from wild plants. Foxglove this is a nice one. There's hundreds of species, but they give us the medicine digitalis, which has been used in folk medicine for hundreds of years. It's a heart stimulant. Even common old aspirin is from willow bark, and that was a common folk medicine as well for hundreds of years. Willow bark tea was a fairly decent pain reliever and headache treatment. Poppies, the opium poppy gave us morphine, which is the best pain medicine that we have at this time. And also for breast cancer treatment, the Pacific yew tree gives us Taxol, which was harvested from trees until very recently. We can now synthesize Taxol directly and no longer need to extract it from trees. And there's also synthetic opiates as well, like fentanyl. Some newly developed medicines. There's two painkillers that there were high hopes for. One from a frog that was called epibetadine after the species name of the frog. This one, though, turned out to have bad side effects, so it is not going to become available. There's other ones in development, though, that are similar. There is, however, a painkiller that came from the cone snail, ziconotide rather. This one, unfortunately, has the drawback that it can't be taken in pill form or injected directly in the bloodstream. It has to be infused directly into the brain, which is a significant downside. They're working on, it's an extremely effective painkiller, though. It's more effective than morphine, and it doesn't appear to be addictive. So they're working on making this able to at least be injected, if not taken in a pill form or a liquid form. But it's available right now. It's been FDA approved. The problem is administering it is extremely difficult. But hopefully that will change in the future. Horseshoe crabs have been used for decades. Their blood has a substance in it which was our best way to detect bacterial contamination in prescription drugs. And it was used for decades to do that, an extremely sensitive test for contamination, so that you wouldn't be taking medicines that had bacterial contamination in them. Well, recently, this substance has now been made synthetic as well, so we no longer need to harvest wild horseshoe crabs to drain their blood to make this test, which is good. That's good for the horseshoe crabs, although they're not endangered. Horseshoe crabs are doing very well. Another benefit to humans of an intact ecosystem is the money that locals can make from tourism and recreation. In Africa, this is from Costa Rica. Costa Rica has done a fantastic job at ecotourism and making making money from their intact rainforest by having really great experiences for tourists who are visiting, like this bridge here through the tops of trees to let people see things they couldn't see from the ground. India also has a great ecotourism business, especially involving their Bengal tigers, which has helped both the tigers and the people who make their living from these tours. One of the things that contributes to biodiversity is the environment. So there's two factors that are associated with more biodiversity: more water and higher temperatures. So the warmer it is, so the closer you get to the equator, and the wetter it is, the more species you get. And this little graphic here just shows you that change just for North America here with only birds. So it's looking at how many species of birds we have at different latitudes. So you can see way up here in northern Canada, there's 40 to 60 species of birds, and then 150 species of birds. And then as we get down to Mexico here, now some areas have 200 species of birds. And we get down into Central America here, and we have 400, 500, 600 species of birds in one place. So remember, the number of species is one of the measures of biodiversity. So we have increasing temperature as we go south here, not necessarily increasing water, just increasing temperature. There are places in the world that have been identified as biodiversity hotspots. So a biodiversity hotspot is a place that has biodiversity by any of those measures. Huge numbers of species found nowhere else. Genetic diversity of the species that are there. Ecosystem diversity, many different ecosystems in a small area. And we'll talk a little bit more about one of these over here, New Caledonia, this largish island over here off of Australia. And you'll notice that in the United States, there's not a lot of biodiversity except in California, thanks to the redwood forests that are found in California. Most of the state of California is considered a biodiversity hotspot. New Caledonia is very interesting. It's not a recent volcanic island. Many islands, like the Hawaiian Islands, are fairly young islands that formed from undersea volcanoes, and they're only a few million years old. New Caledonia is old. It's not a volcanic chain of islands. Instead, it's a piece of ancient continent, and that's one of my chickens outside. Okay, so some of the species that New Caledonia has, it has and had a lot of interesting bird species. Its national bird is the kagu, which is a flightless bird. It's large and strange bird. We find flightless birds a lot on have evolved on islands that don't have mammal predators. Like New Caledonia didn't have any mammals until recently, until humans showed up there. There's also the only tool-making bird, the New Caledonian crow. So remember, from human evolution, the distinction between just using a tool, there's a lot of birds that use tools, and making a tool. Making a tool means you take a natural object and modify it to make it a better tool. So one of the things New Caledonian crows make are fish hooks. They take a stick and bend it into a hook shape, and then they use that for fishing for big fat grubs underneath tree bark, as you can see the one in this picture doing. They're also extremely intelligent and have been shown to solve many problems that their only rival in problem solving among birds are some of the parrots. There's also an extinct bird that's quite interesting. It's one of the largest chicken relatives that's ever lived. It was a chicken that weighed about 65 pounds. And they went extinct when humans showed up. So only about 2,000 years ago, when the first humans made it to New Caledonia, giant chickens went extinct because humans were obviously hunting them and eating them. There is even some stories among the Aboriginal people in New Caledonia. They have stories about these extinct giant chickens. So obviously they were there when these people first showed up for them to have them in their mythology. There's a lot of weird plants in New Caledonia too, including tree ferns. Tree ferns used to be everywhere during the age of the dinosaurs. Most of the trees that we are familiar with today, except for ginkgo trees, they're old too, but almost all of the trees that we think of today that you're familiar with didn't exist for most of the age of the dinosaurs, and they in fact started to evolve near the end of the age of the dinosaurs. Instead, the trees that were around were tree ferns, were very common, and they are outcompeted by flowering plants in most of the world, and there's very few places in the world, most of them are islands or isolated places where you can still find tree ferns today, and some of the largest ones that still exist are found in New Caledonia.